Welcome to the Zeal Interestings podcast. I'm your host, Chris White. Today I have a very special guest, April Wensel. She's the founder of Compassionate Coding. Thank you so much for joining me, April.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yes, I'm excited to have you. And I wanted to kind of get your background, kind of find out what's up with Compassionate Coding and get the story of how you started that. Can you give everyone an introduction to where you've been in your career and what led you to start Compassionate Coding?
For sure. So I have been in tech for about 10 years now, a little over 10 years, kind of the traditional path. I studied computer science in high school and then in college. And then I went to work in tech in Silicon Valley. And so I was there at various startups, quite a few startups, and some larger companies as well for about 10
Awesome.
years as a full stack software engineer. And, I always kind of took on leadership roles, even informally to begin with. And then I eventually moved into formal leadership roles, but still was always coding. And I just looked around and saw through all of my experiences there, just a lot of problems with the industry, a lot of just suffering going on among various people. So it seemed like projects were often failing because of poor communication on teams, more so than technical problems. And I saw that, of course, the lack of diversity, me being a woman in tech and seeing how few there were, that always bothered me. And people burning out, people just didn't seem very happy around me very often. And so, all of these things, the common denominator there is that people, we just weren't caring enough about the human beings involved in the process. And so a combination of kind of frustration and inspiration led me to start Compassionate Coding to try to solve some of these problems by teaching how to care about people in the workplace in a way that makes you more productive and that is better for the bottom line as well.
That's really awesome. I have so many questions. So your company, it's a service business. You partner with companies and help them try to solve these problems. What does that primarily look like? Are you helping leadership come up with strategies, or are you doing trainings?
Yeah, so it's mostly trainings. So what an engagement looks like is a company will reach out to me when they either have some problems going on or they just want to offer it as sort of a perk for their employees. Because a lot of what I talk about helps with avoiding burnout and whatnot. So sometimes it's just to help equip employees with some strategies for dealing with that. So I'll talk with engineering leadership and find out what the most challenging issues are on the team. And sometimes these are technical issues, in terms of officially technical. I use air quotes when I say that because I think the differentiation between technical and non-technical is kind of arbitrary. But sometimes it's literally code issues where it's people are writing code that's literally not compassionate because they're not thinking about the people who are going to maintain this code in the future. And so sometimes I go and I'm talking about, clean code and refactoring and very code-centric topics. Sometimes it's sort of in between. I'm talking about code review practices and how to give feedback in ways that are productive and helpful and not condescending or snarky. And
definitely.
And then it goes up to, maybe mentoring and how to do that well, how to onboard people and things like that. So it's really quite a range, but the common thread there is just it's combining compassion, which is just caring about people, looking to eliminate pain points with coding, software development.
It turns out that software is made by people, and if people are being ineffective at working with one another or they're burning out or anything like that, then that process breaks down. I also like your point about refactoring and code quality. Mm-hmm. It seems like if you're unkind to yourself in the future or your coworkers or whoever is there in the future, that can be a big disadvantage. I definitely, look at some things some days and I'm like, wow, what was that one person thinking when they wrote this code? And of course, more likely than not, you'll look at the version control history and it was you. So it's I guess that bozo was still here.
Totally. Yeah. It's funny because, there's the joke about how one of the hardest things in software development is naming variables. And I think the reason for that is actually not what people normally think, but naming variables really requires a lot of empathy because, the machine doesn't care what you call the variable. You're naming variables for human beings who are going to read the code, including yourself in the future, like you mentioned. And so that's a very specific example of how being able to empathize with what somebody's going to need to know in the future to understand your code is really what you need to think about when you're naming variables.
That's awesome. What have you found to be the most effective change? If someone were to create a BuzzFeed style listicle of the top 5 most effective things to change, what are the main things that people are doing wrong that they can change really quickly or that have been turnarounds that you've seen?
Yeah, so it really does vary across teams a lot, but it's true that there are some patterns that I see over and over again. And I think one of the biggest things teams do is not communicate about what's really bothering them. So a lot of times people come in and think because, when they hear about my company, they think that it's about being fake nice. Because compassionate coding, like I think, I was doing a fireside chat one time and someone said, oh, you're the lady that comes in and tells people to be nice to each other. And I'm like, no, actually quite the opposite. Like in the companies where I worked, I think sometimes I was seen as a troublemaker sort of because I would call out issues as I saw them. And so that's kind of what I do when I come into software teams is I call out issues based on observations. And I don't have to worry about company politics, so I can just, call it like it is. And so I think that that's what we need to do more of is call it like it is. But you can do it in a compassionate way. So I guess one of the biggest things I see on teams is just there's a lot of sort of quiet suffering going on. There's frustrations that are unexpressed. It's like, and it comes out in passive aggressive kind of comments like, people are always joking about how they hate meetings and, oh, it's such a stupid meeting, whatever. And it's like, meetings can actually be really great and effective tools to get work done better. You should work to optimize your meetings, not to just kind of make fun of them and whatever. I was on one team and somebody who had been promoted to a management position, but he was mostly because he was just a good engineer and he wasn't really equipped with training. And he was always complaining about having to do his one-on-ones. And I was just thinking like, I'm so glad that I'm not reporting to this person because you don't want to be reporting to somebody who doesn't want to talk to you and doesn't see the value in mentoring you. So really what that guy needed to do is talk about his problems rather than making passive aggressive jokes about them. So that's one of the big things is just, airing of grievances sort of, but in a productive way, kind of like, like agile retrospectives, right? I love those because when they're done well, they're this really great opportunity for people to share what's really on their minds and what's really bugging them and what they want to improve. And I love the emphasis on, looking to improve to the future, not on blaming anyone. And so I think, so stating, being honest in how you're feeling. And then two, I think just if you're not doing agile retrospectives, start doing them because they're great for any team and for individuals. I try to do one for myself once a week on like what I need to improve and what I'm looking to change. So I think that any sort of like regular reflection is great, however you formalize it.
That's fantastic. I've noticed that my personal happiness in my own job has been really tied very closely to how open the environment is to feedback and like you said, the airing of grievances and it seems like if everybody is holding in all their frustrations, then you're not going to improve your organization because all the problems are hidden to the leadership, which is not productive. And also, there's just a certain amount of I feel like in organizations where I haven't been able to or haven't felt as free to talk about problems inside the organization, that leads me to not trust the leadership of the organization. Like I usually I don't feel like the organization, like if I air my grievances, that's just going to make the leadership hate me and not like enjoy working with me or feel like I'm ungrateful.
Yeah.
And so, I can definitely see that being a huge barrier for people.
Another great technique is there are like little changes in vocabulary and language that I try to instill in teams. So one is to avoid this idea of like right, wrong thinking, which is very popular among software developers. You're doing it wrong, right?
Absolutely. We're very binary people.
And I think that's harmful in terms of effective communication because really, a lot of times it's really how you're looking at the problem versus how someone else is looking at the problem. Also what facts you have and what experiences you have, and even what priorities you have versus what the other person's priorities are. Because sometimes the feedback you're giving to somebody is not going to be as relevant to them because they don't have the same goals. So you sometimes see this when a manager will give feedback on someone's communication style and try to, get them to communicate in the same way that maybe the manager does. And that's maybe not aligned with that person's goals. And so, I think this idea of this is the right way and this is the wrong way just leads to arguments. I mean, even things like, tabs versus spaces and all this ridiculousness has now become jokes in our industry because people can't accept that, oh, I respect that you prefer this and I prefer this and we can both live happy lives and not argue all the time about this, It's kind of silly. And so this is why I felt like I needed to start my company because it's not just like, oh, once in a while there's some, disagreements in software. It's like baked into the culture that people have rants and just, vicious kind of arguments that where you would just attack somebody's identity based on what programming language they choose to use, like, oh, use PHP. Oh, you must be a terrible programmer. Like these kind of comments just get thrown around,
Right. I feel like I've definitely been guilty, especially early in my career when I was finding things that I liked, things that I preferred. I was certainly guilty early in my career of being like, well, anybody that doesn't use Rails is wasting their time and building web applications
Yeah.
too slow. And, I think that sort of attitude, it does to me, and whenever I see it today, I just think that's immaturity. And I feel like the more I see people doing things different ways, the more I see that everything has pros and cons. A really good example is my current pair and I. We work at the same consulting company, but we come from fairly different backgrounds. Like, I've mostly worked on very small teams on very early stage startups, whereas my pair has had a much wider variety of experiences in different sizes of organizations. And so whenever I look at a problem, I'm usually looking at the point of view of like, what is the minimum approach we can take here that will make, our integration tests pass? Whereas I think that my pair frequently thinks like, well, if we do it this way, then we might run into this problem down the road. And if we look at it this way, or if we only do this, then we're kind of ignoring potential issues here. And I feel like the quality of the solution that we're building right now is like really benefited by having both of those angles.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's the thing is when there's healthy kind of tension like that, meaning that there's just, some different opinions and you're able to talk about it without, coming to hate each other or anything like that. I think that's great. I was reading a code review on an open source project not too long ago. And it was a similar thing where someone was giving feedback saying, well, what about when this changes in the future and something like we need to worry about this. And the other person was like, well, that's a trivial concern. And that was like their response. And it's like, so like those are the kind of things that happen. And it's like, yeah. So, I think sometimes you can tell that's clearly, it sounds like a logical thing, like, oh, that's a trivial concern. But that is clearly, using the word trivial, there's some emotion baked into there, like most likely. And so that's another thing, is just another tip there is just to, when you're about to say something or especially write something, take a breath if you're emotional and maybe step back before responding, because you can do some damage that's hard to repair on teams, especially in code review. That's one of like the most toxic kind of areas that sometimes teams have to deal with. I've been on teams where people almost quit over like a bad code review because it was just so vicious,
Yeah, and the GitHub PR interface is text only, right? I mean, you can throw emojis in there, which helps. In that case where it's like that's a trivial concern, maybe that engineer wasn't intending to tell the other engineer that like you're thinking about silly things and you're worrying about the wrong things and you might be a bad engineer because of that. Like that's one reading of that's a trivial concern, right? And once you commit to like terse language that has loaded words in it, you give up the ability to like actually convey your real intention. It might maybe that engineer was just thinking like, hey, that might be a problem in the future, but I'm not worried about that right now, and the project as a whole isn't worried about that right now. Like maybe that's what they were thinking, but they wrote those words, and so they kind of left it open to like for the other engineer to be completely trashed by it.
That's I think what happened. And so. Those are some things teams can look out for sure.
Yeah. It seems like there's interpersonal communication issues at companies. What are some of the biggest like cultural or diversity company makeup issues that you see in software companies that you work with?
I think one of the biggest things is just this sort of assumption that anybody who's a software engineer has to exhibit certain stereotypical traits that in order to be a good engineer. And some
pattern
of these,
matching.
What was that?
The pattern matching when you're hiring.
Exactly. And, it's not always just appearance. I mean, of course, that's an obvious one, right? Like, if you're, a white male, probably, you're kind of fitting my view of what an engineer looks like based on, what I've encountered in my career in pop culture, right? So it's the appearance things, but there's even subtler things like in terms of this obsession with doing side projects in your free time and doing coding all the time in your free time. I can see a sewing machine in the back there. I'm curious if that's yours.
I cannot actually claim those things.
Oh, okay.
They are my wife's activities. But I completely agree with what you're saying. Earlier in my career, my aptitude to doing side projects was so much more than it is today. And today I'm actually dealing with the opposite problem where it's like there's all these outside of work things that are still ongoing and they're legacy things that I'm trying to wind down and like reduce the amount of time outside of work that I'm spending coding. And so it's an interesting tension there, but I've definitely changed my own personal interest in that.
Yeah. And so some people might not realize why that's a diversity issue, but it's just that, different people have different passions and interests in terms of, how they approach life. And so for me, I loved coding. I mean, like I mentioned, I started in high school. I really enjoyed it. It was kind of fun. It was like solving puzzles. I always enjoyed it for the pleasure of actually coding. But now that I've gotten older, and I just see how much of the world there is to experience, I don't want 100% of my time to be in front of a computer. I'm into running and cooking and reading actual physical books and, all these sorts of things that bring me joy. And actually, not that they need to, but they actually make me a better developer as well, because for one, they help me clear my head. But two, some of the collaborative volunteer projects I do give me experience, dealing with different groups of people and, navigating social situations that may also come up in the workplace. So I think this idea that you have to be coding all the time in order to be a good engineer is a harmful stereotype. And, a lot of the old blogs from people like Jeff Atwood and Joel Spolsky kind of made it clear that, that means to be like, the 10x rock star programmer, you have to be coding all the time. Like Jeff Atwood has some quote about the machine picked me or something like that. And it's like, those people, for them, that's great. Like some engineers, that's the case. They feel like this kinship. But for other people, and I've noticed this more among women. I mean, I don't like to generalize, but I will say in my experience, I've seen this more among women, where they're more concerned about the results, like what we're doing with the code, what we're trying to build, what we're trying to accomplish. And that's what's motivating. And I think that that's perfectly fine, right? Like we should welcome all of these, perspectives and all of these motivations.
Yeah, that's really true. I found that I've had the privilege of a few times being connected to hiring processes with engineers throughout my career. And when I'm looking through, you have the resume, you have the cover letter, you have the links to GitHub, et cetera. I've definitely found myself falling into those same like thought patterns of like, oh, well, this person's GitHub project has really great test coverage, and that must mean that they're a good engineer. And that means that the people that don't have that same thing aren't as good of an engineer. And so I think that no matter who you are, there's definitely that built-in ability to put people into buckets like that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. That's funny because, I don't think for any of my projects on GitHub I have test coverage, but when I actually work at a company, I'm like obsessive about test coverage. Like sure. I was pleased that we kept like 99% coverage or something like that. And, I know coverage percentage is only one indicator, but I was pretty obsessive about it. And I actually really enjoy TDD. I teach workshops on TDD. But what's funny is if I'm just building a little fun thing, not necessarily going to test it. Most of the best code I've written is not public code that I can share. And so, and I think that that's true for a lot of people who, care about their work. And like, that's the thing is when I'm focused on like a job, I put 100% into that. So that's the other thing about side projects is sometimes, they reward people who kind of do maybe a half-hearted kind of thing on multiple things rather than focusing all in on one. And so, I think that's why you need a balance too of people with different sort of backgrounds.
I had another question related to culture and makeup of teams. What are some of the important changes that teams of any size can make when they're trying to build a more diverse team? I was listening to a talk. I'll have to link it in the show notes because I don't remember what it was, but the focus of the talk was like, don't get in the scenario where you have a non-diverse team and you're trying to grow into a diverse team. If you can start with a diverse team, you're way better off. But many companies and teams have the problem of the people inside the team don't feel good about the makeup of the team in terms of diversity and diverse backgrounds. What are some of the most important steps that teams like that can take to start correcting that issue?
Well, one is really to do some kind of training in unconscious bias. And I know a lot of people don't like this kind of training because they think, oh, I don't need people to tell me that I'm biased. But here's the thing that I hope everyone understands is that we're all biased. And I include myself in this set. And no matter how much training I go through, I will always be biased because that's just human nature is we have certain biases that are like shortcuts in our brains where, like we talked about pattern matching, we have these. And so I think it's really important before you try to bring people from different backgrounds onto the team, that the people who are already on the team are going to be welcoming. And I think that some kind of training in that can be very helpful because we don't even realize all of our biases. We make biases based on how people talk, and that can be harmful. And so I think doing that kind of training is a good first step. I think it's important to kind of do an overhaul of the hiring processes because, again, there's a lot of ways to accidentally rule out people in terms of looking for what you've always seen means a good engineer, versus, oh, this person took a different path and they have different experiences and they're going to bring a different perspective. And because there's so much work on a software team too, that's not just coding all the time. And so if you're only checking for whether somebody can write code alone under pressure. Like, I don't think that that's a good way to hire people. And it also introduces a lot of issues like stereotype threat, which is this idea that people from underrepresented groups, when they're forced to perform under pressure, they have an additional fear, anxiety of confirming negative stereotypes about their group. So they're going to perform even worse. So I feel this when I'm doing like a whiteboard interview or something, which thankfully is mostly in my past now. But because actually now...
How good are you at solving computer science issues without Google?
Exactly. But so, now I'm lucky to be in this spot where, if I were to apply somewhere, I don't know, in the future, if I decided to change paths, I would just like walk away. Like, I mean, the thing is, like, now I'm just like, okay, if that's your hiring practice, clearly you have issues here. So like, I'm out. And I encourage other people to do that when they can, because there's no reason to put up with kind of demeaning hiring processes. But yeah, so at a whiteboard interview, that can be a really stressful sort of thing. And like you said, it's not like the day-to-day job. So, and I think it's very different even from like a testing scenario, because I was always I love tests. Like, I love studying for tests. I love taking tests. I was a total nerd in that way. And I always did very well in tests. And so, but whiteboard interviews, they're very different in the fact, like, for multiple reasons. One, there's not clear material that you can prepare. So there's no way to really like perfectly prepare for them. So there's a lot of unknowns. And so to go into that sort of stressful environment, especially in front of people who don't look like you, who are assuming that you don't know what you're talking about, is just one of the worst experiences that you can go through, because they're like, a lot of times, whether they know it or not, they may be expecting you to fail. And so their expressions may indicate that, and that's going to make you perform worse too. There's studies that show that when people have they're like crossing their arms, leaning back, looking at you disapprovingly, you'll actually perform worse. So anything that puts people under pressure like that, I think is best to be avoided. What I like to do is kind of offer people a range of things that they can do, like maybe pair programming is one of them, because that's more collaborative. And I think that gives great insight into what it's going to be like to work together from both sides.
Definitely.
Showing past projects if they happen to have them. So that's like an option. Potentially doing some kind of take-home exercise, again, if they prefer. Like, because if you provide these options, then you kind of can, again, have more diversity in terms of your candidate pool, because these are different styles that will suit different people. And you can have a standardized rubric so that it's fair to judge people's skills across those different types of projects, but some kind of range like that. And then I also really, the best tool I think in hiring, especially for diversity, is talking about past projects and asking really detailed technical questions about them to, because there's this fear, oh, someone's making it up, which I'm sure they're not, but so that's like another thing, is to like give people an opportunity to talk about what they're proud of, and to talk about give people the opportunity to show their strengths. And then final tip on the diverse team thing, don't just hire one person that doesn't look like everyone else on the team, because they're going to feel isolated. So at least two, but of course, the more the better.
Definitely. I found that the main thing that I try to look for when I'm trying to find new colleagues is the ability to communicate and the ability to solve problems. I feel like whiteboard interviews really, really, I mean, you might be able to elicit some of that, but I think that like they're so unlike the work that we do, that exercises like live pairing or asking about old projects and kind of teasing out like the decisions that someone made when they were working on those things is super helpful. One common thing that I hear, especially when companies or groups are challenged on their hiring practices, is that the diverse hiring pool is not present. I'm not sure that I necessarily agree or believe in that counter argument, but as far as what a team that's looking to improve can do, how do you attract more diverse talent, or talent that just doesn't have the same background as your existing team?
Yeah, I think that one thing to do, and I think a lot of teams use that as a cop-out, to be honest, is calling it like it is.
Definitely. Sounds like a cop-out.
But because like I will say that like I built out an engineering team, like I was the first one and I built them out, and we were like 50% women of color, like diverse ages, and it just happened because, when you take the steps to make it happen, you can make it happen. I mean, we solve all these like complex technical challenges and we can't find candidates. I mean, it's kind of silly. But anyway, but that said, for people who are still using that excuse, here's what you can do. One is to seek out meetups for like women, people of color, other underrepresented groups, and send people there to like recruit but also just to like talk with people. I think, sponsoring events like that too can be helpful in terms of, you don't want to do it just for the show, but I mean, in terms of actually attracting clients,
sure.
Candidates. Most important though is to, like I mentioned earlier, like make your culture friendly and inviting to those people. So like what's on your hiring website? Like if your website, and it's hard because if you're just getting started and trying to diversify, and so your team pictures are going to be all white guys, like that's not going to be very inviting to me or to, other people from underrepresented groups. It's like, oh, I'm going to be the only one. And I've been the only one many times, and I can do it, but it's not the most pleasant experience because it's like you're always the one that's like, people are like, oh, look, the girl's here. Oh, look, just horrible things that you have to deal with. So I think that, trying to make your website more welcoming too. And that might mean maybe you don't just like talk about how everyone gets beers together because that's not necessarily something everyone wants to do. Maybe you have diverse perks that you share as well. There's things like that. So I think getting different perspectives on what you're putting out there is also helpful. And also your actual job ads, like what language are you using? Are you using really aggressive language? Like I was reading some job ad that was talking about like sweat and blood and tears and everything. I was like, that's not appealing to me.
Yep. Cyber ninjas rock stars, or something like that.
Gurus. No, that's not appealing to me. I think if you talk about like collaborative environments, things like that, and there are tools out there that will do a read on masculine and feminine coded words in your job ads. They're not perfect, but they're a first stab at that. And then the other thing is to actually pay people, who do this kind of work to look at your job ads and whatnot, because that's the other thing too, is a lot of times people will ask me to do reads of their stuff for free. And I'm like, and other underrepresented people as well. And it's like, that's not really, this is important work. And so it needs to be compensated. So if you're going to ask people to do that, you've got to compensate them too.
That's a great tip. It's editing just for a different reason, right? That's awesome. Well, we're coming up on our time, but I wanted to ask before we go, is there anything that you'd like to draw our listeners' attention to, or anything that you'd like to promote via the podcast?
Sure. Yeah. So if people want to stay in touch and, hear more interesting opinions like this, I've got a newsletter at compassionatecoding.com. I haven't sent out so many recently because I've been giving people a break and kind of making some plans, but I'm going to start ramping up pretty soon on sending those out. So compassionatecoding.com is the best way to stay in touch.
Awesome.
And my Twitter is at April Wensel. So that's another way. I tweet quite a bit.
Very cool. We'll definitely put those links in the show notes. Thank you very much, April, for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. This was super fun.
Yeah, definitely. And thanks everyone for listening. If you'd like to, you can follow us on Twitter at CodingZeal, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.